Israel has launched a new offensive in Gaza, shifting focus to the southern half of the territory where Israel says Hamas leaders are hiding. Israel has widened evacuation orders in some areas. Heavy airstrikes are reported overnight in the Khan Younis area. Wounded Palestinians crowded into a hospital. Israeli forces also hit targets in northern Gaza and in the south near Rafah. Gaza's health ministry says nearly 200 Palestinians have been killed since the week-long pause in fighting ended on Friday. And Israel is facing growing calls from the U.S. to avoid further harm to civilians in the territory. Journalist Iris Mackler reports from Jerusalem.
Just over 48 hours since the truce collapsed, it's almost as if it was there was no truce. You know, the fighting has resumed, the airstrikes have resumed, the rocket attacks into Israel from Gaza have resumed as well. We saw rocket attacks into the Tel Aviv area, so central Israel, yesterday for the first time in almost 2 weeks. And what we saw this morning was the IDF still in the north of the Gaza Strip, sending a message to Hamas leaders in Shaja'iyah, which is part of Gaza City, telling them to surrender or to be killed. That's what we're hearing from the north of the Gaza Strip at the moment, that announcement in Arabic to them. And in the south of the Gaza Strip, we've seen airstrikes, as you've been reporting. And we've seen reactions from health authorities on the ground. The UN, one of the UN agencies there, the Director for Gaza Affairs, is saying that there's actually an outbreak of some diseases, hepatitis A, in one of the UN schools, and that's despite the fact that there is a resumption of humanitarian aid into the Gaza Strip. And those airstrikes in the south, Israel, both in the north and the south, says it's designated safe zones and is dropping leaflets to tell Palestinian civilians to go there. However, the Palestinian civilians in the Gaza Strip have come from the north, and this constant motion and this constant fear is both confusing and actually it's almost overwhelming for them. So even though they may have designated safe zones, they do not feel safe. They don't think there is a safe place. Israel is focused on Khan Younis because it's a city associated with the two main leaders of Hamas in the Gaza Strip, Yahya Sinwar and Mohammed Deif. And we have heard calls from the WHO when it's describing what's going on at Nasser Hospital, one of the hospitals in the south of the Gaza Strip, saying that a ceasefire now really is necessary.
Talking more about the ceasefire, Iris, we know that Israel recalled its negotiators, truce talks. It's describing those truce talks, as a dead end. So what is the latest when it comes to potentially restarting those discussions among world leaders?
There's a difference, I think, between world leaders and leaders on the ground. We heard from a very important Hamas leader who lives outside of the Gaza Strip, Salah al-Aruri, last night, and he was speaking to Al Jazeera, and he said, that's it, the truce talks are over. They were always centred on a hostage release in return for a ceasefire, and he said there'll be no more hostage release until the end of this fighting. So that seems to be shutting the door in the face of truce talks. I think that's part of the reason that Israel recalled its Mossad, its intelligence agency, officials who were on the ground in Qatar last night for a total of only 90 minutes in total. But world leaders are still, if not optimistic, still determined to keep trying. And that includes Qatar, of course, where many of the talks were taking place, Egypt, Washington, and we even heard from the French President Emmanuel Macron last night, who was in Dubai for COP28, said he would go across to Qatar to try and put a European angle or a European force behind this wheel. But I don't know if the people on the ground are as determined as the international leaders.
That was journalist Iris Mackler in Jerusalem. For more, we are joined now by Reuven Hazan. He is the chairman of the Political Science Department at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, and he is in Jerusalem talking to us today. Thank you so much for taking the time to chat with us. And I want to start with this temporary ceasefire. It is now over. We know that there are now heavy airstrikes that have resumed. What do you think is the end game here?
Well, the end game was always a mixture of two goals. Some of them might have been impossible to achieve simultaneously. One was to destroy the military capability of Hamas to cross the border and butcher innocent Israeli civilians once again. And the second was to release the 250 or so hostages that Hamas held. it was felt in Israel that in order to get Hamas to the negotiating table, they had to feel the burden of a military assault. And that is exactly what happened. And as soon as they got a couple of days of reprieve, they stopped sending the lists. They refused to hand over innocent women and children that were taken hostage. And that is what led to the end of the pause and the resumption of the fighting. And hopefully this will once again make Hamas rethink and maybe go back to returning the hostages.
And it really does, come down to the hostages right now for many of the families who are waiting. We see those images behind you as well as we continue to see the images of what's happening on the ground there. Benjamin Netanyahu, we know, has faced a lot of criticism over how he's been handling the situation. So do you think he's working for his country or himself at this point?
Oh, that's an extremely complicated question. Benjamin Netanyahu is perceived in Israel not only as handling this situation poorly, but also as being responsible for this situation. It was his mistaken policies that allowed Israel to be so surprised on October 7th. And the end result of that is all of the hostages that are in Hamas's hands. His government has not functioned properly in the almost 2 months since. He is still playing politics, trying to keep his old coalition together, because the day after this war, there will definitely be a lot of recriminations, a committee of inquiry into all the wrongdoings, and he wants his political friends to be there to watch his back. So he's definitely not doing what is exactly in Israel's interests, unless it also coincides what is in his own political interests.
And you say that as we know that there are still more than 100 hostages that need to be released back to their families. Of course, they're hoping that will happen soon and safely. But given what you just said now, what is Israel's public appetite for the war? And has it changed since that war began on October 7th?
Actually, no. If anything, it has increased. After October 7th, the images that we saw in Israel, and I don't need to go over them for you. You've seen them. The babies that were burnt, the people who were beheaded, the women who were raped, it made us realize that we cannot live next door to Hamas anymore. This is living next to a caged tiger that is just waiting for the first opportunity to slaughter you. So we went in. Now, the fact that we managed to get out some of the hostages just made us realize that the only thing that Hamas understands is force. They refused to negotiate before, they refused to hand over hostages, and they've now stopped to want to negotiate with us. So regretfully, there are civilians that are paying the price on both sides, but with Hamas in power using their own people as human shields and using our hostages as human shields, there aren't too many alternatives for the Israeli side. And public opinion is way behind the government right now.
And as you just mentioned, many civilian lives have been lost. In the meantime, though, Israel facing mounting public pressure from the U.S. to do more to protect civilians. Do you think that pressure from not only the U.S. but other countries around the world is having an impact on what their decisions are, and their actions?
Oh, definitely. I think basically what you just asked before, the Israeli public wants a full-scale military invasion in order to completely destroy Hamas. And in order to do this to a terrorist organization that embeds itself in the civilian population and uses them as human shields, there is going to be civilian collateral damage, and that is regretful. Now, Israel understands that the only way to make this come to an end is to hit Hamas as forcefully as possible. And yes, it is international pressure and the United States at the head that is making Israel do this just a little bit slower, trying to minimize as much the civilian casualties, trying to bring in humanitarian aid, because as President Biden said, democracies fight war in a different way. But the civilian population that is being hurt in Gaza is not being hurt because Israel wants them hurt. It's because of Hamas that has embedded itself in the civilian population, building armaments in schools, hospitals, nurseries, and so forth. It's regretful, but this is the enemy that we face today.
Reuven, I want to thank you so much for your time. That's Reuven Hazan, chairman at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. Thank you so much for your time and your insights.
Thank you.
Tens of thousands of people rallied in Tel Aviv last night, calling for the immediate release of all hostages taken by Hamas. Among those in the crowd, a former Israeli hostage, a 50-year-old woman who was freed last week. Pleas from other released hostages were shown on video to the crowd. A 7-day truce saw Hamas release more than 100 hostages in exchange for the release of dozens of Palestinian women and teens being held in Israeli jails. But the temporary pause ended on Friday. Hamas abducted more than 240 people during the October 7th attack in Israel.